Mega Evolutions, Z-Moves, Dynamax, and Terastalization. Like them or not, Game Freak seems to be in the habit of adding a new battle gimmick or mechanic every generation, and with Generation 10 potentially coming out in 2026, everybody's wondering what the next one will be. In fact, theorizing about what the new battle mechanic could be every time a teaser trailer drops is half the fun for me. Just like everyone always wants to see the new starters, legendaries, professors, and rivals, trying to figure out what the new battle gimmick is keeps me on the edge of my seat. You probably know what I'm talking about if you remember the first reveal of Mega Mewtwo Y. Additionally, these battle mechanics can seriously shake up the meta of the game. Underappreciated Pokemon get to shine in new ways, whether that's through giving them updated stats, new signature moves, or updated abilities that seriously buff them. In another sense, these gimmicks can help make small changes to the tried and true Pokemon formula, as seen in Scarlet and Violet, where each gym leader uses an ace that's a different type than their gym specialty, thanks to Terastalization. In this video, I'll be examining the 4 existing battle gimmicks and talking about some ideas for new ones for Gen 10. Hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Only 5% of my viewers are subscribed to me, and I've watched enough YouTube to know that that's a metric I should talk about. So, if you're watching this and you've already watched my 2 other videos, what do you have to lose? With that, let's head into the video. So first things first, let's take a look at existing battle mechanics from Gen 6 through 9. We'll see what they did well, what they did poorly, and any trends that emerge that help us get an idea of what Game Freak is looking for in these mechanics. But before that, I imagine some of you are already itching to go to the comments and tell me that my list of gimmicks is incomplete. So I just want to take a second to say that things like held items, abilities, and regional forms don't count. Let me explain the distinction here. When I use the term generational battle mechanic or battle gimmick in this video, I mean a mechanic that is only usable in battle. It must be activated by the player, so not a passive like an ability or automatic like a berry, and it should be limited to 1 use per battle. These mechanics are also always made to be at least some part of the story. Maybe it's not what the story really revolves around, but the game will go out of its way to tell you what it is, like Korrina giving you a Mega Lucario in X and Y. So starting with Gen 6, we have Mega Evolution.
If you've been a fan of the Pokemon series for really any time now, you probably know what this one is. Slap the right Mega Stone on your Pokemon, and then bam, it gets bulkier, spikier, and hairier. In battle, you technically have the option to delay your Mega Evolution, but there's not really a reason to since the benefits are so big. Mega Pokemon receive really good buffs to their stats and abilities, and often their typing even changes to be more competitive. Mega Evolution is probably the most generally beloved and iconic generational gimmick, but even then, I'm sure me just saying that has set a bunch of you off in the comments. I think people are so fond of Mega Evolution because it was really the first time that Game Freak decided to make this trend of revisiting old Pokemon. Nowadays, a regional form, regional evolution, or conversion species is kind of a regular thing that we expect our old beloved Pokemon to get. But back in 2013, if a Pokemon was already the 3rd and final entry in its evolutionary line, it was pretty much set in stone. That's not to say that's the only reason people like Megas though. It's personally my favorite gimmick because I think it's just the most visible. Not only do these forms look really cool, but it really kept me on the hype train, thinking about which other Pokemon might get new Megas, and what new types or abilities they would get if that happened. Now, fair warning, I'm not a big competitive player, but even I can see that there were just a few issues with this gimmick in that realm. The big one is being its inflexibility. Since there are only 46 Pokemon that can Mega Evolve, and a few of them not being very good, you're already somewhat limited in terms of which one you pick. That's not necessarily a bad thing though, as competitive play has always revolved around a small set of Pokemon. However, as a gimmick itself, it's just kind of a shame if you're waiting for it to be applied to your favorite Pokemon, and then it never is. Additionally, having to give up your item slot hurts the mechanic a bit. This isn't because I think Megas should be able to use items. In fact, I think that was an intentional decision on Game Freak's part. However, by giving your Pokemon a Mega Stone, you're pretty much committing to evolve it before the battle starts. I suppose the worst thing you could say about this mechanic is that it's similar to adding 46 new overpowered Pokemon to the game, but then it's a little balanced by having no items and only being able to have one of them on your team. I think this all sums up to a mechanic that is aesthetically and mechanically really cool and fun, which is why I think we see it pop up in a lot of main series side games like Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee and Legends ZA. Next up are Z-Moves from Sun and Moon. While maybe not considered to be the worst mechanic competitively, I think most would agree that this is the least interesting or iconic gimmick. These moves either dealt a lot of damage, often doubling the base power of the original move, or had some pretty cool effects, like Z Parting Shot recovering the ally's HP by 100%, or Z Splash outperforming regular Swords Dance by raising attack 3 stages.
The coolest thing about this mechanic was that any Pokemon could use it, so you didn't have to lock into a super small set of options. But there were still several bespoke Z moves that could only be used by specific Pokemon holding species-specific Z crystals. I think the biggest reason that fans didn't like this mechanic was due to its aesthetics. It's often remembered by the awfully long and unskippable battle animations, and I personally also just don't like the names for some of them. Sure, Z moves like Sub-Zero Slammer or Hydro Vortex fit right in with the existing Pokemon games, but Pulverizing Pancake, Let's Snuggle Forever, and Soul-Stealing 7-Star Strike just feel a bit over the top. Additionally, Z moves still required you to equip the corresponding Z crystal to your Pokemon as a held item, which created some of the same problems that Mega Evolution had. Once again, you couldn't really be super flexible with this mechanic. If you're giving up an item slot for it, you better be using it. But this time, one misplay or unlucky switch or protect from your opponent could make it all seem wasted. With all this in mind, I think it makes sense that people aren't really begging for this one to come back. Moving on to Sword and Shield, the name of the game was Dynamax, but sometimes Gigantamax. Sort of being an attempt to combine Megas and Z moves, once per battle, the player can select a Pokemon to Dynamax, which then gets really, really big. Primarily, this increases their HP, but it also replaces all their moves with new Max moves, which give attacking moves big power buffs and additional effects, and turn status moves into Max Guard, a really beefed up version of Protect. Gigantamax was essentially the same thing, but for specific Pokemon, giving them unique forms and signature G-Max moves. The big twist of all of this was that it only lasted for 3 turns. I tend to go back and forth on this mechanic. Competitively, a large portion of the community regards this as the worst battle gimmick simply because of how much it changes the game, though there are some notable players who make their cases for it. Making your Pokemon a big, bulky kaiju that can deal nuke-worthy damage with devastating side effects every turn makes the game a very offense-heavy one, and removes some of the strategic variety the series has been known for. However, I do like that it doesn't require you to use an item slot, giving you a lot of flexibility to use this mechanic. This means you can switch up your game plan on the fly, and having it only last 3 turns means that it's a strategic decision to know when to use it. You don't just lock in and use it for the rest of the battle. Dynamax itself can be used by any Pokemon, so you think that would help distribute competitive usage of different Pokemon, but then Gigantamax kind of undid this by putting the spotlight back on certain Pokemon who had the coolest signature moves. Overall, I think it's clear why Dynamax is remembered as a controversial mechanic. Finally, we arrive at Scarlet and Violet, which introduced Terastalization. This mechanic allows you to change the type of your Pokemon for the duration of the battle, giving it one of these dorky looking hats. When a Pokemon is terastalized, it becomes defensively whatever type it is, immunities and all, but offensively, things are a little more interesting. The terastalized Pokemon retains their stab bonuses from their original types, while also getting a stab bonus for their Terra type, potentially stacking if it matches one of the original types. This means you can be really creative with which Pokemon you're going to terastalize, and what type you'll terastalize them into. I think Game Freak really showed that they learned from past battle gimmicks with terastalization. As A, it doesn't require a held item slot to be used, B, you can use it on any Pokemon in your party, and C, there's still a lot of strategy in terms of when you use it. Unlike Dynamax, Game Freak didn't make any special terastalized forms of Pokemon like they did with Gigantamax, so you do see a lot more variety in terms of which Pokemon your opponent will use the mechanic on. I think the biggest downside to terastalization for me is how they used it in the story of Scarlet and Violet. All the gym leaders use this mechanic, but seemingly backwards from how I'd want them to. Each gym leader has an ace on their team that does not match their gym's type specialty, but then it terastalizes into that type. This seems really cool at first, but what it really does is just allow me to keep spamming the same moves I already have been for the duration of the fight. I think it would have been a lot cooler to see them use an ace of their type specialty, but then terastalize it into a different type that would shake up the game. Overall though, I think the competitive community has received this mechanic very well, and I think it's a really good one. So with all that recap out of the way, let's talk about what works and what doesn't. We learned from Megas and Z moves that giving up a held item slot isn't super preferable, but it's not the end of the world. If you're gonna do it, the battle mechanic should be at least good and consistent enough to warrant it. We learned from the other 2 gimmicks that being able to be flexible on which Pokemon and when to use it creates a lot of strategic play. But Dynamax also teaches us that if a battle gimmick breaks too many of the in-game rules, gameplay tends to all move to one space and suffer for it. So let's look at a couple options for Gen 10 gimmicks and examine whether or not we think they would be good fits for the series. The first options I'd like to talk about are kind of the elephants in the room, either no gimmick or all gimmicks returning for Gen 10. Firstly, I do think that no gimmick could definitely become something of a gimmick of its own. And it would be fitting for a big number like Gen 10, especially if it releases in 2026, Pokemon's 30th anniversary. It's been a while since we've had a real mainline game come out without any sort of generational battle mechanic. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were the closest thing to that. While I think it would definitely be hard to market this in a positive way, I do think that there are a lot of fans who would love a return to the tried and true Pokemon formula. Alternatively, bringing back all generational gimmicks could be seen as a celebration of the series, also fitting for that big double-digit number and 30th anniversary. While this could be really cool, I'm not sure how feasible it would be to balance all of that together. Take the current VGC format, for example, where only 4 Pokemon are actually brought into the battle. Theoretically, then, you could bring in 1 Mega Pokemon, 1 Pokemon with the Z Crystal, Dynamax 1 Pokemon, and then Terastalize the other. If Dynamax had a tendency to change the game too much and push things in a hyper-offensive direction, I think this definitely would. And sure, you could potentially balance this by only allowing one of these 4 mechanics to activate per battle per team, but even then, I just think the meta would kind of devolve to whichever one of them is the strongest. I do think having all 4 gimmicks available in the story of the game would be cool. It could definitely shake up some of the gym leader battles, as now you're left with guessing which one they're going to use. The Elite Four also just seems like a cool place to showcase all 4 of them back to back. Finally, if Pokemon was going to bring just one of these gimmicks back, I think it would either be Terastalization, since it's probably the most balanced and strategic gimmick, but since it's so recent, Megas might be more likely, especially due to their popularity and imminent return in Legends ZA. All in all, I think no gimmick is more likely than all gimmicks returning, but it's still somewhat unlikely in the long run. Game Freak knows that the real moneymakers for this franchise are children, so I don't think they'd stop putting any new big flashy mechanic in their faces. Raid battles also seem to be becoming a new staple for the series, and it just works perfectly as a place to show off the new mechanic. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think Gen 10 will definitely have something to show off. Next off, I'd like to talk about a gimmick that everyone and their mother seems to want added to the games. Fusions. Listen, I get the hype. When I was 9 years old, I would boot up my dad's computer and watch Pokemon Fusion videos on YouTube while drinking a Capri Sun just like you did. It feels like the concept of Pokemon Fusion is really popular right now, perhaps due to some certain fan games out there, but also just due to how frequently we get little tastes of it in the series. While you could consider Dugtrio, Magneton, or even Slowbro to be some of the first fused Pokemon, I think the first real appearance of Pokemon Fusion in the games is in Black and White 2, where Kyurem could be fused together with either Zekrom or Reshiram. This concept was then tried again in Gen 7 with Duskmane and Dawnwing's Necrozma, and finally with the rider forms of Calyrex. Okay, I know Calyrex doesn't really fuse with its steed, but hey, they share a Pokeball.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
There are also some examples of fusions in the anime and manga, probably the most famous of them being Venustoys. When it comes down to fusion working mechanically, I think there's 2 ways you could go about it, but one of them just really doesn't work. The first is to make it an activatable battle mechanic, similar to the other ones we've been talking about. If you had a Pokemon out on the field, maybe you could fuse it with another Pokemon in your party, but how would that work in double battles versus single battles, or triple battles if they ever bring that back? It seems like it would be a detriment to your team to suddenly go from 6 Pokemon to 5 Pokemon, or in the case of VGC, from 4 to 3. Dondozo and Tatsugiri maybe confront that logic a bit, but I think to make it a regular battle mechanic, fused Pokemon would have to be really overpowered in order to make up for that lost Pokemon slot. Therefore, I think if Pokemon Fusion was really going to be added to the game, it would work like it does with Kyurem, Necrozma, and Calyrex, being more similar to ideas like regional variants and Paradox Pokemon. I really don't think we'd ever be able to fuse literally any Pokemon in the dex with any other, as that would just shoot development costs right through the roof. But with 48 Mega Forms, 32 Gigantamax Forms, and 22 Paradox Pokemon, I think we could get ourselves a big enough roster of fusions to pick from. Mechanically, I do think fused Pokemon could offer a lot of interesting options for your party. If each one is predetermined by Game Freak, they could give them bespoke type combos, so we wouldn't just have to default to taking the primary typing of both Pokemon. Maybe you either get to choose which ability the Pokemon has, or maybe fused Pokemon could just have 2 abilities at the same time, or maybe Game Freak would just make them unique abilities. For move options, I think you should still be limited to 4 moves, but you could maybe pick them from all of the combined movesets of the 2 Pokemon. Some Pokemon I would really love to see fusions of would of course be Venustoys, as it'd be a really cool nod to the anime, and also it would even things out between those 2 starters and their more beloved third counterpart. I also think a Slowbro Slowking fusion would be hilarious, and if it's ever possible to fuse 2 Pokemon of the same species, a double Mousehold would also be very funny. But overall, I think Fusion is not really a contender for a generational battle gimmick, but still could work its way into the series one way or another. So now let's finally get into some new ideas for battle mechanics. For this first one, I wanted to see if I could think of something based on the popular idea of armored Pokemon. The concept is an easy one to gravitate to. There are lots of examples of armored Pokemon across the anime and fan games, and well, it just looks cool. Pokemon are mostly animals after all, and humans have been putting armor on animals for thousands of years. It's in our instincts. However, in a way that's similar to Fusion, this is the kind of gimmick that could open the door to heavily increased development times, as making armor sets that work for every Pokemon in the dex becomes a huge task. If only there was some sort of clothing customization we could take advantage of that's already in the game. Wait a minute! When thinking of how to make this idea work, I was drawn to the concept of character customization. Ever since Pokémon X and Y, customizing your player character with different clothing and hats has been a frequently recurring feature in the franchise. So what if we actually put the armor on the player character, and then maybe there was some sort of battle bond that could happen during gameplay with the Pokemon? When the player activates this battle mechanic, the selected Pokemon could become bigger, though not as big as Dynamax, and then they could also become translucent. We could maybe then see a faint image of the player inside the Pokemon, as if the player's actions in the armor are affecting the battle prowess of the Pokemon. In my mind, this starts to play into some piloted mech tropes, similar to Pacific Rim, which fits perfectly into a series that has already done the big kaiju thing. I think this armor could work on a sort of slot-based system, where different armor pieces could give you different kinds of enhancement slots for your Pokemon. I'll suggest two types of enhancements that you could give to your Pokemon. The first would be extra resistances. Imagine having a Landorus out on the field, but then through the power of your armor, you could cancel out its 2x weakness to water by using a slot to give it extra water resistance. Likewise, you could lower its 4x weakness to ice to only be a 2x weakness. Maybe you could get 3 or 4 of those resistance slots, so you have the choice between stacking up on a resistance to one type, or covering your bases across multiple types. Maybe if you do stack resistances to one type, it becomes more expensive to do so the more resistances you add on. Secondly, I think it'd be really cool if this armor allowed you to use multiple held items. This could get really overpowered really quickly, so we need to say that more powerful items take up more slots than less powerful ones. It might be a little overpowered to give your Pokemon all 3 choice items, for example. I think you could also put an X item in one of the armor slots, and that item would just be consumed as soon as the armor is activated. Lastly, I do think this kind of mechanic would be really cool for a Germany-based region. Who knows? Maybe this game could even take place in the past, in a place like the Holy Roman Empire, since there's no concrete reason that only the Legends games can do that. I think this mechanic seems like a cool idea because it kind of pushes things in a more defensive route than other battle gimmicks do. And it provides Game Freak with a lot of room to balance out what held items or resistances could be used by limiting armor slots and increase slot costs on more useful items. It's also a mechanic that could be somewhat upgradable over the course of the story, which would be a first. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. For the next gimmick, I started to think about what people didn't like about Dynamax, with the emphasis being that it makes the game hyper-offensive. I think we already just went over a defensive mechanic, but I was thinking that maybe it'd be cool to explore a mechanic that can't just be switched on immediately and requires some prep time. So moving forward, I'm gonna call this gimmick Limit Break, borrowing the term from the Final Fantasy series. The concept of a limit break is common enough that it has its own article on tvtropes.org, where they define it as a powerful attack or technique that's only available after some sort of requirement in battle is met. In some of the Final Fantasy games, this is based on damage taken. However, methods of filling up a limit break meter vary from IP to IP. I think a mechanic like this would be a really cool addition to the Pokemon franchise because it would be the first time that a battle mechanic is not solely activatable by the player, but instead could create some chess-like big brain plays to trick your opponent into causing you to limit break. I think something that would make this really interesting is if it wasn't just 2 limit break meters, one for you and one for your opponent, but rather one that was kind of like a tug-of-war. If you're able to skew it far enough in your direction, you get to limit break, and you get to keep your opponent from limit breaking. For example, if the requirement is just taking a lot of hits, that might devolve into most players using Swords Dance 3 times and then trying to sweep in order to minimize the hits they're dealing. But if the requirement is hitting a certain amount of turns without taking damage, well, Protect would sure to be spammed, but then status conditions like Burn and Poison would be made more popular, as well as moves like Feint. But enough of abstracts. How does this mechanic actually work, and what happens when the limit break meter is filled? To answer this question, I thought of another trend people are noticing with existing battle gimmicks. Megas are a riff off of evolution, Z-moves off of moves, Dynamax off of stats and moves again, and Terastalization is a riff off of Pokemon types. It seems that Game Freak has a habit of looking at the different attributes Pokemon can have, and then using them as a base for the new generational gimmick. For that reason, a lot of people think that abilities might be the next thing to be affected. So, what if the way you filled up your limit break meter is by fulfilling the requirements of your ability? For example, if you have a Scissor with the Technician ability, you could get a limit break point every time you use a move under 60 BP. First things first, not all abilities are created equally. An ability like Kudchu is naturally something that can only occur once, while Technician can be used again and again. So, each ability would have to increment the limit break counter by a different amount, allowing Game Freak to balance this battle gimmick to each ability.
The amount of points you give for each ability would then of course affect which Pokemon might be popular in the meta.
Abilities that make you immune to certain moves like Levitate, Clear Body, or Soundproof might need to have higher increment amounts, since once your opponent knows you have that ability, they're not going to keep using those moves anymore. Abilities like Snow Cloak that raise a certain stat under certain conditions could have a smaller increment amount, but maybe accrue that increment amount every turn the condition is met. Whatever effect is granted has to provide a big advantage in the battle. I actually think this would be where something like Dynamax could shine. As I mentioned before, Dynamax hurt the overall meta because of how much it changed it up. But if it were a reward for strategic play, and not a given, I think it would be more acceptable if it were kind of overpowered. So, I'll say that when the player finally skews the limit break all the way over to their side, they'll be able to use that limit break whenever they want from this point on in the battle. Their opponent will no longer have the chance to limit break. The player will select one Pokemon to activate this mechanic on, but it will affect all the Pokemon they have on the field for the rest of the battle. The Pokemon they activate this mechanic on will just determine exactly what effect it is, and that will be based on their highest stat. Since we had an ability theme going on for how to limit break, we'll then base these stat-based effects on other in-game abilities. If the Pokemon's highest stat is HP, we'll base the effect on the abilities Regenerator and Magic Guard. For Regenerator, we'll fully heal the health of any ally Pokemon on the field, and also any that switch in, but only once for each Pokemon, so not quite like Regenerator. For Magic Bounce, we'll then protect all Pokemon on our team from any sources of damage that aren't attacking moves for the rest of the battle. If a Pokemon's highest stat is Speed,
we'll loosely base the effect on Gale Wings and Armor Tail, meaning we'll give priority to all of our Pokemon's moves and block priority moves from the opponent's Pokemon. This effectively means that our Pokemon will just always move first. If the Pokemon's highest stat is its attack or special attack, we'll base the effect on Adaptability, Mold Breaker, and loosely base it on abilities like Pixelate, Aerialate, and Refrigerate. This will mean that all stab moves do 2 times damage instead of 1.5 times damage, moves will pass through any abilities that would otherwise block them, and all normal type moves will be turned into the primary typing of the Pokemon using them. Finally, if this Pokemon's highest stat is its defense or special defense, we'll base the effect on Battle Armor, Filter, Disguise, and Clear Body. Firstly, this will keep our Pokemon safe from critical hits. Secondly, we'll lower their damage taken from super effective moves. The Disguise portion of this will give every Pokemon on the team a free hit, and Clear Body will keep their stats from being dropped. Now, sure, these effects might seem really overpowered, but you need to remember that you don't just get them for free. all of these effects only happen if you win the tug of war, so in really strategic gameplay, it might not even happen during a battle. Are these effects too complicated then? Well, maybe, but I think it could be cool.
In any case, let's move on to our final mechanic. Lastly, I think it would be really cool to bring back a mechanic from a beloved game, Legends Arceus. That game was famous for shaking up some of the givens about the Pokemon formula, such as making the game focus a lot more on catching than battling, having Pokemon be able to kill you, and, of course, its interesting sequential battle system. Normally, Pokemon moves are chosen simultaneously. I pick Water Gun, you pick Quick Attack, and then we see what happens. However, in Legends Arceus, it works a bit differently, where moves are chosen sequentially. First, it's my turn. I pick Water Gun, and then we watch the animation and you take damage. Then, it's your turn. You pick Quick Attack, we watch that animation, and I take damage. The reason this isn't super noticeable is because there's no PvP in the game. This kind of battle system isn't exactly something we could bring into the main series, but I think the strong and agile style moves are something we could adapt. Strong style increases the damage you do, but might make you have to wait longer before you attack again. Agile style does the opposite, lowering the damage but allowing you to attack again sooner. Obviously, this concept of attacking again or sooner or later doesn't really translate into the main series mechanics very well, so we'll have to do a bit of work on it. The first major change we'll make into this system is that you won't be able to just use it on every move with no material cost. Since this is a generational battle gimmick, we'll try to follow suit and say that both the strong and agile styles are states you can put your Pokemon into once per battle for maybe 3 or 4 turns. Strong style is the easier of the two in terms of translation into the main series games. Taking inspiration from Legends Arceus, we'll say that strong style increases the base power of your moves by 50%, and that increase is also given to healing moves and recoil damage. Damaging moves will still do 25% damage through Protect, just like max moves from Sword and Shield. We'll then say that the chance for additional effects happening will double. When using a stat changing move though, we'll amplify that stat change by 1 stage, meaning stat raising moves will raise them higher and stat lowering moves will drop them lower. But finally, we'll try to match the slower action speed part of this Legends Arceus mechanic by making all of this Pokemon's move drop 1 priority bracket, and then they'll always move last in that priority bracket. Strong style here sounds pretty similar to Dynamax, but remember that it doesn't raise their HP or include any of the weather setting kind of effects that max moves had. We also won't make the strong styled Pokemon immune to most things that Dynamax Pokemon were, like flinching. This would kind of turn the game into focusing your efforts on the strong styled Pokemon. Maybe you really want to try flinching it, or you really want to try to paralyze it so that maybe it can't move. Maybe you want to use a move like Torment against it so it can't just spam the same move at you all the time. Or maybe you just want to disable the move that you think it's going to use against you. Agile style was a little harder to translate, since the major reason to use it in Legends Arceus is to take advantage of that sequential battle system. However, I do think I found a way to replicate this, and to do it without just letting the Pokemon attack twice, which would just be too similar to strong style. Let's start off with the negatives, which are mostly just opposites of strong style. We'll decrease move power, but only by 25%, and this reduction will also hit healing moves and recoil. We'll also half the chance for any additional effects on moves. But the upside of this mechanic will be that all of our Pokemon's move go first within their priority bracket, and they can optionally make 2 moves in 1 turn, but only if those moves are 1 attacking move and 1 status move. We'll further balance this by reducing the effectiveness of stat changing moves by 1 stage, meaning that you can't just use Screech in order to do double damage on your next turn. I think this could result in some cool combos. If you're planning to use Flamethrower, now you can throw up Sunny Day right before it. If you want to use a move like Venoshock or Hex, you can now set up that status condition right before. Overall, I do think this mechanic could be pretty interesting, and it'd be cool to see it come into the main series games. I like how it presents you with 2 options instead of just 1, which does keep your opponent on their toes a bit. And with that, that's all the battle gimmicks I have for today. If you like this video, give it a like or a subscribe, and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. I've got 2 other videos on my channel, and they're both really similar to this one in terms of discussing potential Pokemon mechanics. If you liked this video, you'll probably like those too, and watching them back to back will really help me with the YouTube algorithm. With all that, I'll see y'all in the next video.